Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have a returning guest, Sandra Fahy. Sandra was on the podcast almost a year ago to speak about her first book, Marching Through Suffering, Loss and Survival in North Korea, which was an in-depth look at the famine years in North Korea through the eyes of defectors. I'm going to link it below the podcast because, amongst other things, it will add context to this podcast as well. Because today we're going to be focusing on her newest book, Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on the record. Both these books are published by Columbia University Press and will be linked below as well. Now, this was a lengthy podcast, so I'm going to break it into two parts. And I'm going to separate it in the same way that Sandra separates her book. This first podcast will focus on the crimes, and the second following podcast will focus on the denials. So today we're going to look at the history of the human rights violations inside North Korea, the impact of these human rights violations, and where responsibility ultimately lies. How the famine years affected not just the right to food, security, and work, but also forced citizens into unusual positions of violating their own state law simply by surviving. We are also going to step into religious persecution, the control of information, the control of movement, labor, and of course the system of prison camps across the country, as well as torture and execution. But this is not going to be an encyclopedic retelling of UN charters and human rights legislation and the fine particulars of where North Korea do and do not violate these statutes. All of that is in Sandra's book, but throughout this podcast and the following podcast, we're going to focus as much as possible on the narratives and the people involved in the process, the stories of defectors, the events surrounding the United Nations Commission of Inquiry and other UN bodies, and how North Korea see themselves in this through outlets like the KCNA and the Rodong Shinmun. Now, I might leave the introduction here. I'm not going to go much longer. As I said, this is already a podcast that we broke into two. And so the level of detail here and analysis is going to be evident for anyone that listens through. But just on a quick note before we do get to the podcast, in the background occasionally you're going to hear Sandra's cats doing their best to participate in the podcast. As she told me, they were there through the writing process of the book, so it's only appropriate that they are there also for the podcast. But I promise you they are not a distraction, and if anything they add something to the overall storytelling process. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. We do not run advertising in any way. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast directly at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Failing that, you can always share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. All the help in this regard is greatly appreciated. On that, and to walk us through the first half of her book, Dying for Rights, and to focus on the human rights violations and crimes inside North Korea, this is Sandra Fahy. Sandra Fahy, welcome back to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you, Jed. Lovely to be here with you.
So we spoke about a year ago, a little over, about your first book, Marching Through Suffering. And that was a focus on the famine inside North Korea. But today we're going to talk about your new book, which is Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on record. So I might start with yourself and your personal place inside the research, because as you write at the beginning of the book, you've been doing this for almost 2 decades, this focus on human rights in North Korea. And you write a few things about how challenging this must be. So I might start with a couple of quotes. You start by quoting Rilke, poet, which made me quite happy. I'm quite a big fan myself. And you say South Koreans are a fan. So I'll start with Rilke's poem, and then we can jump in from there. It says, "Among these winters, there is one so endlessly winter, that only by wintering through it will your heart survive." And you talk about speaking to North Koreans, and one of them says to you, you said that he chided you. You say, that's our life. You have only researched it. And I wonder about a question about how you found yourself now talking about human rights in such a deep way, and how your life has taken you here, and just how challenging it can be for a researcher, and also how you must be aware that despite how challenging that is, you're only touching on such a small fraction of what the actual suffering is. So I might get it as a first question to take us into your new book and your place as a researcher in this narrative.
Okay, thank you, Jed, and thank you for reading through the book so carefully. And I'm happy to hear that the different points that I made early on really kind of captured your reader's mind, I just really wanted to share with readers what it's been like for me, being a researcher on this topic for, almost 2 decades. Now we're in 2020, so it's 19 years that I've been working on this. And, the conflict that you have just as a human being, and the necessity to have humility and to be humble in the face of like this difficult task, how much you can do, how much you can accomplish, and then just what it's like to interact with defectors who are, of course, very human and have their own response to things, their own response to you. These are individuals who are experts on their own life, we say, in North Korea, not necessarily experts on human rights, not necessarily experts on famine, not necessarily experts on geopolitical strategy, but, whom you have to, as a researcher, or you want to, as a researcher, engage with these individuals to, really mine the depths of their own experiences and their own understanding of their positionality, because it's so unique and special. But in the process of doing that research, you have to battle all kinds of other very human, personality-driven sorts of issues, So there's that. And sorry, that's my cat. He's very vocal.
That's fine. That's fine.
He was present during the writing of this book, offering many critiques on the side.
Good stuff. Yes.
Yeah, and you also asked in the question kind of what brought me to writing this book. I had originally been writing a different book when my editor at Columbia and a few senior professors in the United States, wrote to me and said, would you be interested in writing a book about the whole human rights situation in North Korea, because the Commission of Inquiry, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, which we can talk about, came out in 2014. And my first book came out 2015. And then in that year, I was also approached by Columbia, would I be interested in writing this book? And I have to be honest, I thought very carefully before I wrote it, because the thing is, when you focus on something, that's what you see. And, but it's really interesting because, I hesitated before writing this book because as an anthropologist, I recognize that things are nuanced, that, I watch North Korea's propaganda channel, École DPRK, and things look reasonably good. It's not all convincing. There's definitely a strong, you could almost say straitjacketed propaganda going on. But it's not uniform. That's the nature of inequality and human rights violations, So I thought very carefully before writing the book. But I'll just say, I think my answer is getting a little long, but I'll just say, when you write something, you learn about it as you write. I've never written about something that I know completely. Like as I write it, as I examine the interviews, the research, the data, I learn as I write. And in this book, as I wrote it, as I researched it, I became profoundly convinced of, the truly horrendous situation of human rights in North Korea. Academic nuance aside, there's really no other way to slice it. So, the other book that I had been working on was about military defectors, people who defected from North Korea while they were doing military service. And I may still work on that, but I'm not sure. Anyway, that's parts of that were incorporated into this book. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
No, it does. Yes, absolutely. And if you do write that book, please come back on the podcast.
I think it's cool, because the whole thing about military, if I can just say this, military aesthetic is very strong in North Korea. The idea of Roma, like romance associated with militarism. There's a whole cultural aspect to it too, which is quite fascinating. But anyway, and nobody's done any research with them. So if anyone's listening to this podcast and wants to do a research project, by all means, do that research project.
Yes. Let's jump into the content then and the details, and we might wind this right back to the beginning. Not that it is the most fundamental thing, and we're not going to focus just on the history and the detail of rights here. We're going to speak a lot about personal narratives and the current moment. But I think it is important to go back to the colonial period in 1945 and the very origins of the North Korean state, because it does give a perspective on just how fundamental and ingrained and how original a lot of the human rights abuses were. So I might here to take us right back there to that colonial period, to the origins of Kim Il-sung, and some of the very early emergences of these human rights abuses with things like early purges, the suppression of the Yang'an faction, and the growth of his cult of personality.
Mm-hmm. So if you look at North Korea's human rights issues purely, let's say, from social, political, or even economic struggles, let's say, we not even use the terms human rights, would just say difficulties. Many people would establish it from, maybe the 70s, late 80s, the famine, things really got bad. But with the book, what I really wanted to uncover were the earliest indications of, as Langkov talks about this, the seeds were planted there in the earliest days of the founding of the North Korean state. So, Kim Il-sung's response to colonialism had been to, and you could say, well, this is quite reasonable. I mean, think about it with colonialism. This is, and when I'm teaching my students, I always say, let's not look at North Korea from now, but look at it from the point of view of 1945. Like, maybe it would have seemed quite attractive that you've got this leader who's going to eliminate all this foreign stuff, like this idea of creating cultural purification, like bringing you back to who you were, what you were, prior to Japan occupying your people linguistically, culturally, in so many aspects of life. So I think doing that helps the students to kind of appreciate how many people might have thought that that was an attractive notion. But what ended up happening in the case of North Korea was that notion of cultural purification also took on a strong political kind of feature, a political feature. And so on the surface, things might have looked politically diverse. For instance, there were, democratic institutions, elected parliament, there were local councils who were elected, but like none of these were ever contested. There was only one candidate for one seat, and they were handpicked, things like this. You mentioned the Yang'an faction. These are individuals who were, contesting what was going on inside North Korea politically, concerned about what they saw as the cult of leadership developing. They challenged this. And it was squashed. So, Kim Il-sung held show trials with these associates from these political factions were, accused of crimes and executed for instance, being spies of the Japanese. Anything that was a threat to Kim Il-sung was identified as foreign and about usurping the power of the legitimate North Korean or ethnic Korean political power. There were, if you look, just for instance, the fact that even nowadays, North Korean defectors, people who leave North Korea for whatever reason, are hunted down and assassinations attempted on them. We can think of Kim Jong-nam, excuse me. That was happening very early in North Korea too. I'm drawing a blank on the date, but I think as early as it, listeners could correct me, but I think it was 1958. There was a dissident that was killed in Moscow. So, this is something that's been present from the earliest stages in North Korea, that there cannot be any political competition.
So from that idea of, I suppose, seeding human rights from the very beginning, let's talk about famine. And for listeners, our last podcast was all about famine and defectors' narratives and the intricacies of language and how it came about. So I'm going to link that. So if people want to podcast just on the famine itself, I'm going to link that. I encourage them. But let's talk about famine briefly. And in that same way we spoke about there, the idea that it was seeded from those early moments. So without the specifics just yet, let's talk about Amartya Sen and this idea that many people will have about famine, that it's just about a lack of food or about adverse weather conditions, when really it's got nothing to do, well, not nothing to do, but very little to do with those things. It is about the state, the government, the power and the control of the political establishment.
Yeah, I was just speaking with a colleague of mine the other day, and it amazes me to think that people could actually, today, 2020, actually imagine that famine is somehow connected to nature. I mean, it's just absolutely incorrect. So, yes, I mean, you mentioned Amartya Sen, who's an excellent political economist. I believe he won the Nobel Prize for economics. Excellent scholar, famine scholar. And basically, let's see, in paraphrasing him, he identifies that, famine isn't about the absence of food, but the inability to access food. So food is present. The issue is who has the ability to access the food that is present. An additional aspect of it that Sen identifies is that some people have the ability to alter their access to food. So, for instance, if the public distribution system, which North Korea ran for, since and up to the famine, was the system of delivering food to people, resources to people. When this shut down, so that was your primary means of accessing food. But if that's running out, then, you can alter your access to food by selling in the market or doing other activities, which many eventually were able to do in North Korea. But you have to remember, North Korea has combined some other aspects which make the famine very difficult to live with or survive. So, for instance, North Korea doesn't allow people to migrate within its country freely. So you're not able to relocate to another part of the country that may have better access to markets, better access to food, better access to farming, for instance. You can't leave the country if you wanted to. You can't legally do that. Also, North Korea runs a system of songbun, which there's a very interesting report by Robert Collins and others that identifies that songbun, the public distribution system, allocated food differently according to classification of people. So already you have differences between men and women and the types of occupation in terms of access to food. So, also we have things like early warning systems. So if there's likely to be a drought or a flood, which we know contributed to problems in North Korea, that was predicted. And in such a case, governments should respond to those predictions. Governments which are democratic would respond to those predictions. But in the case of North Korea, they didn't. Amartya Sen also notes that famine hasn't happened in a country that has free media. So there's this combination of the fact that people don't have freedom of expression, people don't have freedom of information. The country, in the case of North Korea, is not allowing people to migrate, to move, to change their job, to get access to food, et cetera, et cetera. So it's completely incorrect to say that the famine in North Korea was due to natural disasters. It was absolutely the government's failure to act when it could have, and it's a failure to adequately give access to aid organizations to help those most in need. Some people say that North Korea deliberately starves certain portions of the population. I personally haven't seen evidence for that, but one could argue that the public distribution system, which allocates food according to songbun, which then stopped intermittently at certain phases during the famine, you could say that that was a deliberate form of starving. And in fact, North Korea knew, for instance, that there were orphanages. The government knew that there were orphanages in other areas of the country that had no access to food. And knowing that people have no access to food, no ability to move, migrate, no ability to try to get different jobs, basically you're just letting nature, quote unquote, starvation, take its course.
And on a similar note this is quite a remarkable aspect about North Korea and about famine in itself and what it did to the country. So after the famine itself and what happened inside people's lives, so those who survived the famine, who were not in those privileged positions in Pyongyang and centers like that, they were forced into criminality in some ways just to survive. So I might get you to touch on that idea that the famine forced people into breaches of law or common behavior that they never would have been forced to before. So simply by surviving, some of them had become criminals, and they had their minds and their behaviors and aspects of their lives changed by the famine. So I might get to touch on that human aspect of the famine as a catalyst for change and also forcing people into violations of their own state law.
Right. So, the book details, anti-socialist behavior in North Korea and how that's criminalized. And, my first book talks about how even to critique or to say you were hungry would be literally counter-revolutionary. You couldn't say that you were hungry. You could say you were in pain. So the fact that there were even those controls on the voice, on articulating genuine felt experience, is an indication that restrictions on behavior were also huge. But you couldn't even say that so-and-so had died of starvation or died of hunger. They died from pain. This is something that the first book uncovered. Many, when you have a situation where, I talk about this in the book, so many of the human rights violations in North Korea overlap with each other. They're like a web. If you, as a spider gets stuck onto one part of it, the whole thing shakes, the whole thing is pulled together. So for instance, lack of information in North Korea, this is a huge, huge issue. It's not the only problem, obviously. But if you think about it, it's not as if North Koreans have lacked free information since 1945. They've actually lacked free information since the Japanese occupied the peninsula. They have never seen media made by, for, and about their own people. I just lost my train of thought there. But in this context, when you have people compelled, like their back is against the wall to make a certain decision, well, prior to that, perhaps they'd been quite loyal or kind of acquiesced to loyalty, or just kind of, like a kind of somnambulant state. Like you almost become asleep to the fact that, well, you're powerless politically. How can you get politically engaged? I mean, the type of political engagement you see in North Korea is at the level of your own personal political critique of yourself and those around you. And that's very sort of, psychologically demeaning and not genuinely political at all. So there might well have been many people who were happy to just kind of carry along how life was and were not so happy with themselves when they had to make decisions about selling in the market or migrating to different parts of the country or bartering, having to bribe soldiers to get certain things that, these types of crossing into China, these types of behaviors that formerly would have been, socially questionable, now they were compelled into doing, otherwise, their lives were at stake.
Let's press into religion, and this is a very interesting one. And many people listening will know that there's not freedom of religion inside North Korea. But as it comes through your book here, you write that, of course, in North Korea's own constitution there is freedom of religion, and but they've actually spent the last ever since their inception trying to crush this as quickly as possible. But this is an interesting thought here, because you write here, and I quote, "Faith is hard to destroy." So this is one of those things you imagine to yourself, I'm going to wipe out a religion from a country. It sounds like one of those things you're destined to fail in, but it feels from the outside that North Korea have done a pretty good job at this, if that's a very morbid way to say it. And on the other side of this, I'm not sure how you see this, but you write, and I'm going to quote North Korea's own human rights report here, and they say, "Everyone is fully provided with the rights to choose and follow their own religion and thought according to their own free will." And then you write, "However, the following paragraph suggests that every North Korean has miraculously chosen Juche," because they go on to say that everyone inside the country has chosen Juche as their particular faith. Now, we can get into whether Juche is a religion or not, and Brian Myers would like to have the discussion, I'm sure. But I might get you to start on that idea of religion inside North Korea, these attempts to crush it, how successful it's been, the difficulties with it, and this idea that North Korea self-profess freedom of religion despite clearly doing the opposite.
So, North Korea, I think I say somewhere in the book that they've got this kind of two-tiered approach, or two-tiered approach to religion. They say in the Constitution, of course, that they have it. North Korean representatives at the UN will happily wave their constitution at you and want you to read it and think, oh, okay, well then, since you say it on paper, it must be the case. I mean, classic kind of propaganda. There are many churches in Pyongyang. The two-tiered approach is basically to collect money from the international community. The PUST in Pyongyang, I'm not sure what the acronym stands for, but basically, getting resources from the international community. So that's one way that North Korea collects money. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's see. I mean, there's so many things to say about this question. They used to say things like Pyongyang was the Jerusalem of the East. This is a classic thing that's said. That even Kim Il-sung's family, there's a religious aspect to his family, his background. And if any of us who know South Korea know that, charismatic Christian belief is very strong in South Korea. So it's interesting to think, well, it wouldn't be a far stretch to imagine that the same thing could happen in North Korea if there weren't such suppression. Activists that I know in the religious activist community say that there are lots of underground churches in North Korea. I mean, lots, I don't know. They say there are a few underground churches, secret churches in North Korea. There's some other quotes about, people having a Bible brought back from China into North Korea, and some kid bringing it out to show it, and the family getting in trouble. The North Korean regime has to suppress religion because it could provide an opportunity for people to gather and worship or have faith in something that is not the Kim dynasty, the Kim family. And that could be a huge threat to them. And, North Korea claims that they have freedom of religion, but their very own literature contradicts this. Just like you read, everybody has chosen Juche. Well, it's simply impossible that everybody has chosen Juche. I mean, 1-year-old doesn't choose Juche.
Let's push on to the KCNA and the media itself then, if that's all right, because
Sure.
this is one of the fascinating parts of both your books that I really found, which is your detail to language and meaning behind it, so rather than just reading and listening. It's a focus on what the intentions are and what is trying to be manifested across to the listener in these moments. So let's talk about KCNA and also Jang Song-taek, which was Kim Jong-un's half uncle who was assassinated. And there's an interesting moment here, because whether he is guilty of the crimes that he was committed of, where he was charged with, but that's pretty irrelevant, I suppose. We're not going to be able to find that out from the outside. But it is important that North Korea self-reported on this and self-reported on it in detail. There isn't thought out there that if you could have insurrection inside your country, perhaps we should just keep this quiet and make everyone think it is peaceful and harmonious. But this is, you're right, that North Korea report on this and report on it in detail. And you say that this is because they are actively trying to think what people may be thinking out there in the community, and then put a block on that expression, that hope for change. So they're trying to imagine the discontent that may be forming inside North Korean society, and then also trying to show how pointless or dangerous it may be for you to actually engage in this behavior.
So the narratives of what is possible in North Korea are extremely limited. The kind of control on, the narrative, like how this story could possibly end. If somebody's going to take up dissidents, if they're actually going to try to form a faction to resist or to try to create change, they have an eye, I'm assuming, they have an eye to what they'd like it to be, how they'd imagine the story to end. So I sort of feel in the case of Jang Song-taek and other stories where they'll put in the media, and the book goes into those later with the return defectors. They show the futility of it, the extreme danger of it. He's humiliated. His efforts are shown as completely futile. They're fatal. His efforts are literally fatal for him and others. So, they try to preempt. And as I said, previously, to us, we might think, gosh, but that's so, and how could that possibly be effective? But if you've never had free media since 1945, and actually it goes back far further than that, you need to include Japan's occupation of the peninsula. The permissiveness of a narrative dissolves unless you are a profoundly independent creative thinker, which I guess they exist, but you need others around you to support and push your own creativity. We don't work in isolation. We don't develop our intellect or our resistance or our rebelliousness in isolation. We need like-minded others around us. And if you don't even see any smidgen of that anywhere in the news that you read, we can get into the issue of foreign media coming in, but if you don't even get a hint of that anywhere, then I argue that it's unlikely to that the faith that things could be different is unlikely to be very strong.
Let's also touch on another interesting aspect of that exact same part there, which is the emotional messaging here. And this is one of those interesting things. It's you touch and you say countries like this, words must be transmitted through an emotional frame at all times in these reports. So when you talk about Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-un, it must come across with this emotional seriousness. And whenever you speak about a country like South Korea or America in particular, there must be a certain invective before each word. So you have to say things like anti-revolutionary Korea or warmonger in the United States. You cannot just say United States. There's a bit of Trumpianism in that. The idea you must put someone's, you must put a derogatory slur in front of someone's word, in front of someone's name. But it must have an impact, I'm assuming. Sometimes when you see Trump doing it, you think, oh, he's just been childish. But when you see KCNA, who are not unsophisticated, they come across as unsophisticated for some people. But you spend a lot of time listening to them, and you're right. There's actually a lot of sophistication in here. So I'm assuming a lot of this has an impact. It must work to some degree.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of literature out there, which is beyond the scope of my own discipline, but that, argues that human beings, we're not logical decision makers or thinkers at all. Like, we're very emotional in our thinking. And, even people who've done studies on the stock market or geopolitics identify that emotion is a big factor. And this isn't unique to North Korea, of course, and I know this, and I'm sure the book says as much. Most of the academic literature that I'm citing in that section is actually looking at the United States. And yeah, you mentioned Trump. I mean, classic example, he uses, in the few kind of words that he does have at his disposal, they manage to be quite emotional. And well, anyway, North Korea does that too. There's never just a noun. It's always modified in some kind of way. And that tells the reader how to use it. But also, there's a kind of patterning that happens in language. If that's the way you've always seen things written, then that is how you will likely write them. And I've never done a study on North Korea's education very closely. Education's mentioned in this book, but I'm sure if someone does a study of education in North Korea, those styles of writing are likely to be translated into the classroom as children write things down. So, yeah, the emotional aspect is how we make decisions. And I mean, I'm sort of, my mind is going on a digression because I'm imagining that this happens in South Korea too. The type of movies that are made, TV shows that are made about North Korea creates a certain sort of emotional messaging in that sort of soft power, for good or for bad. It's happening. I mean, the same thing's happening in North Korea, but it's not toward a kind of view of South Korean soldiers as our dongpo, as our brethren, but still as the enemy. So, yeah.
well, in that emotional messaging, I suppose we can open up a couple of themes here, but I might do it through the personal narratives of two people, and this should hopefully give listeners an understanding of just how people in North Korea walk a knife edge that is always there, but you can't, probably from the outside, it's hard to imagine that it is there. And this touches on questions of freedom of expression and just simple mistakes that we all make at all times in our lives. So two narratives that you talk about. So one people is Jang Hae-sung, who worked in the media himself. He was in the communications, and he wrote a typo. He misspelled Kim Il-sung's name. And for this, he spent 6 months in a re-education camp. And when they say re-education camp, this is not re-education. This is a horrible place. And then also another writer, another person inside North Korea, not a reporter, but a writer themselves. And this is Hyung Sang-ga. And he got drunk one night and simply said that he didn't have the ability to write his own ideas. He was being told what to write. And for this, he was sent to Camp 15 as well. So that, I want you to open up that idea, that I suppose that knife edge inside society, but how completely restricted and terrifying it must be in every aspect of your daily life in these countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's you might have become aware of that book, Bandy, which was translated by, I think, Deborah Smith was her last name. I can't, drawing a blank on it, but said to be a book of stories that was smuggled out of North Korea.
There is also a book of poetry that's just come out from the same author, apparently.
Oh, okay, great. I wasn't aware. Thank you for letting me know. So, I've often wondered, because we saw from other cases of authoritarian regimes, there were people writing privately, clandestinely on the inside, creating samizdat. I've often wondered that must be happening somewhere in North Korea. And we do know of some writers who have defected. The author of the book, Dear Leader, which is an excellent book, the need to create, the need to write. And I've heard so many stories about intoxicated North Koreans saying things that they shouldn't be saying, letting things slip. and then ending up, as you said, in these re-education camps, which are not about re-education, they're about hard labor and re-educating the mind to think according to how the state would like you to think. But it is true, like you said, it's a knife edge. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. It's human to make a mistake. And yet in North Korea, it's not permitted. You know, the book talks about how within the media itself, the news media, that the information is double and triple checked up the line, down the line. The narrative voice is absolutely, uniform from the earliest Dorong Shinmun article to the present. The writing style, the voice, what is said, how it is said, completely uniform. The man that you mentioned who had the typo error, he had been loyal to the regime, to the Kim family up until that point. And when he realized kind of the tenuousness in which his life was balanced, it was a real shock to him. The same for the author who was, drunk and articulating his frustrations, and then ended up in a prison camp. So, but it's a little tricky because then, this is a bit of a footnote, I suppose, to what I'm saying, because, there's an academic by the name of Emmanuel Kim. He's just translated the book, I think it's called Friend.
Friend, yeah.
From Korea, from North Korea, and it's said to be, with Columbia University Press, it's published, said to be the first North Korean book that's translated into English. Well, North Korea has translated many of its books into English, and many of the writers actually are phenomenal writers. North Koreans are they're incredible wordsmiths. But this book, Friend, and I haven't read it, so I don't know, but it's touted as, showing kind of the nuance of human life in North Korea, et cetera, et cetera. I have to read it, I'm not sure, but I'm deeply skeptical that anything that gets the official stamp of approval in North Korea is going to in any way show nuance or, genuine, like human. I don't know. I'm skeptical. Let me just put it that way.
Yes.
And I will be reading with close attention.
Well, let's step into the movement of the control of movement inside North Korea. And again, I might do it with a very interesting personal story. And this is one I suppose most people listening to this podcast will be aware of. And this is 2017 in November, as a North Korean soldier drives his truck towards the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and then runs across the border, and North Korean agents chase after him and shoot him at the same time. And this is important for a number of reasons, because it speaks to the question of internal migration inside North Korea. Because the rare thing about this is that he must have come from an upper class inside North Korea. He must have been deemed safe, or he never would have been placed in that place in the first place. So there is a whole series of human rights freedoms and declarations about the freedom of movement and the freedom of labor and things like this. So I might get to touch on this moment, what it says about North Korea, and the idea of you being bound in your freedom of movement inside the country.
Yeah, that was an incredible moment. People, we were all watching. I can imagine everybody except perhaps the Kim family were rooting him on. And I had the great opportunity to meet him.
Oh, really?
As well, yeah. So I can share some thoughts about that, actually, because I did ask him some things in particular, not on this topic of movement, but let me just address that for a minute, because for those uninitiated to the Korean Peninsula and human rights over there, they might think, oh, well, how long could it possibly take? You just run across. And Mr. O, this young soldier, he perhaps he has the fastest defection to South Korea. And fair dues to him, but, so many others who are predominantly women end up crossing from North Korea over into being sold, being treated like an object that is sold. Not all, of course, not all, but most, the chances are. and spending years trying to get out of China or back from China into North Korea. Of course, many cross over to get resources to improve their family lot in North Korea. Then once in China, not always able to get information back to friends and family inside North Korea, stuck in China. China doesn't recognize you as a refugee. You don't have access to healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. You're basically dependent on the kindness of complete strangers in that area. So for most defectors, it doesn't ever get caught on camera, like we saw with Mr. O. It doesn't ever reach the international public attention. So he did something that was truly spectacular and totally almost unprecedented. I think there's only 2 other cases of somebody crossing the DMZ. So, and the interesting thing about this is, as you said, Jed, like to be there in the first place, to have been up at the joint security area, he would have had to be the creme de la creme in terms of family background, to even be anywhere near that area. And then anywhere near Pyongyang, for instance. I don't know, listeners may know this, but up in the northernmost part of North Korea are the more questionable subjects. Not all, not entirely. Of course, there's elites up there too, but there is this stratification according to geography in North Korea. The poorest, most rural areas are where there are people who, there was a question of did they have connections with, the southern part of Korea during the Korean War, which side were they on, who did they have contact with, all this kind of thing. So for him to be up there in the first place, totally unexpected that someone of his caliber would defect. The other thing that's interesting about the defection, of course, is that, these sharpshooters came out of nowhere carrying AK-47s, totally against the law in that area, shooting him. This is totally against international human rights law, absolutely. Military personnel who's defecting, it's not legal to shoot them. This might sound unusual to some people, but this is true. And the North Korean soldiers who were chasing him as he drove his van and tried to drive across, and then jumped out of the van and ran across the joint security area line. The sharpshooter, even for one moment, crossed the line, and I believe with the intention of bringing the body back. They might have thought he was deceased. They might not have been sure, but they have to get his body back. And I say in the book, those guys, most likely they wanted to shoot and kill him because he was a traitor in that moment. Likely they all thought that. But even if they didn't, let's say, even if they thought, oh, well, I'd like to give it a go too, their duty is to catch him and kill him, because otherwise, if they don't, there are going to be serious repercussions for them. And I think, outside of the killing of Kim Jong-nam, which some dispute, but is clearly an operation of the North Koreans, that was probably one of the other cases where we have North Korea committing human rights violations on camera. So that's quite interesting to think about. But that form of migration, some people I mention also in the book end up getting on fishing boats and ending up in Japan, which is far more rare. The vast majority of defectors, upwards of 80%, are women. They're crossing over into China. They have little linguistic or material resources, basically have nothing but their humanity left to them once they cross into China. So, that's the issue with migration. And then, of course, within North Korea, migration is also severely curtailed and controlled.
So I can't let that pass, though. You mentioned you met this defector personally.
Yes, yeah.
So tell me. It might be a bit of a diversion, but it's just too interesting to ignore. How did that go, and what insights did you get from this?
Well, for me, I asked a particular question because, I asked a few key questions. And the meeting was off the record, and There was another military defector who was there. It was fascinating to meet him because, as I said to him too, when I shook his hand, I mean, it's like meeting somebody it is in fact meeting someone who is the hero of their own life. But, you can't help but think, like, here is this young person, and the decisions that we make at the age of 24, 25, it's incredible to think the decision that he made at that age will have a lifelong impact on him and his family. Of course, I stayed away from the question about his family because he asked those present to stay away from that topic. For me, if I may, I'll let you know the type of question I asked him, because I am still quite interested in this issue of military defection and military life in North Korea. I mean, that's what I wanted to get at with that book on the military defectors, was kind of like, what is the esprit de corps? Like, what is the spirit of the military in North Korea? Because, years ago, I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this in the first book, but I was sitting down over dinner with this North Korean defector who had done his military service, and a South Korean man who, of course, had done his military service. And, they kind of started talking about their military duty and things like this. And, the South Korean made this joke that, if war breaks out, we have this joke that we're going to wait in the trenches until the Americans come and help us out. And then the North Korean just started laughing, and he said, oh, no, we have this saying that, like, within 30 seconds, we've got everything, all of our kit on, and we're ready to come down and kill you. Mm. And so I asked Mr. O, I told him this story that had happened over the dinner and what he thought about it. And it was interesting because in the meeting as well, there was a young South Korean man who had done his military duty, and he was asking about that new TV show. I'm drawing a blank on its name. Have you watched it? Something like Crash Landing, I think it's called.
No, I haven't seen it, no.
Well, basically, it's a TV show. Like, as I alluded to earlier in our conversation, South Korea makes all these kind of TV shows or dramas about, North-South issues, which are fascinating. And to me, they're very interesting. But I think among the South Korean youth, perhaps not professional military, but among South Korean youth who do their military service, there's a kind of romantic brethren, uri dongpo, our brethren view of the North Korean soldiers. Like, once we meet each other in armed combat, they will realize I am also Korean, and they will certainly not want to fight, So this, sorry, the story is going on a little bit, but just if you could stay with me here for a minute.
No, it's just too interesting. Keep going, yeah.
The young, in the group too, this young South Korean who had done his military service asked Mr. O, he said, look, you've seen this, have you ever seen this TV show? Mr. O hadn't seen it. And he said, what do you think? Because we sort of have this feeling that, like, we're brethren, And Mr. O, I was watching Mr. O's face as the question was coming to him, and he just looked like, are you mad? Like, absolutely not. Like, no way. They don't feel that way at all. So, I mean, yeah, it's the other thing I asked Mr. O and his fellow who was there with him, also a military defector, I said, because Mr. O had alluded, like, life was so difficult in North Korea, he said. This was so jaw-dropping for me to hear him say this. He said, life was so difficult in North Korea. Now, remember, he's from a privileged class. That sometimes we almost wanted war to break out so that there would be an end to it. And I have heard North Koreans say that before. But do
they tend to mean, just, I suppose it's inference here, do they tend to mean war either way, as in we get conquered by the South or we conquer, or is it always a conquering spirit behind it? Or is it just a kind of fatalistic, as long as it's over kind of attitude?
Well, so that's interesting that you asked that, and it's important to interrogate it further. So, he said that, and then other questions came up, but I brought him back to it, and I said, you said life is so difficult in North Korea that you almost wanted war to break out. But you also said that you would decimate the South Korean soldiers. So clearly you want to make the South like the North. But it's incoherent, because if you make the South like the North, you'll still be without resources. the problem is politics. Fascinatingly, he said, to me it was fascinating, perhaps listeners can imagine he said this, no, if we conquer the South, we'll have all their resources. I couldn't believe it, because it just shows, I mean, this is, it's illogical. I mean, the North could have as much, if not more, resources than the South if they only altered their politics and their governing style, you know?
Yeah. That is, yeah, sorry, continue, yes.
Well, it's chilling because there was this kind of desire to rebel against the situation of the poverty and the difficulties of life inside North Korea, and to claim everything that South Korea has. Of course, you would destroy it in the process of claiming it, only to make it all like North Korea. It would all be, of course, it would just be a mess again.
That is such an interesting moment in history. I mean, I just get, that's actually an insight, I suppose, in some ways into your research here from the outside. You pick up a book and you read through it like I have done for both your books, and you think to yourself, okay, I've got an understanding of what she's been doing. But from that, you really get this personal interaction, a personal touch on North Korea, and each defector you must bump into is got that potential to really open up a brand new world in some ways. It's like there's so much darkness out there, and suddenly someone can explode a little pocket of light just like that.
Yeah, and we can't make the types of assumptions, you know. That's why I like to ask questions that seem maybe a little dumb or a little naive. Because I asked him when he said that, oh, we want war to break out. I said, well, do you want to win it? And some people were laughing, but he said, absolutely, you know, which it's just because we sometimes imagine that they just want to bust out of that system just to change that system. So
from that as well, it in some ways, listen to there, it touches on a theme that runs through a lot of this is the success of ideology inside North Korea, because people have an understanding or thought in their mind of there must be moments of rebellion all the time. And I'm sure there are, and you've documented a lot here, but there also must be an awful lot of people believe in the narrative and believe in what is being told to them. And I might get us to walk into the prison system itself and the gulags are just too big to open up in a podcast, but I'm going to open up again with a personal narrative. And that is of a former prison guard who did stand before the Commission of Inquiry, and he was a remarkable witness in some ways, because a lot of these defectors are the people who are being punished in some ways, but he was the person dishing out the punishment, at least at this stage of his life. And he was asked by Justice Michael Kirby at the time if he was ashamed of his behavior. And he looks at them and he looked back and he says, at the time, I thought the inmates were all truly bad. As in, why would I possibly think that? As in, it's almost an inconceivable question there. So I might get to walk us into into those prison camps in a way. I know we're not going to be open up entirely here, and that idea that it's almost accepted that if you're there, it's because you've done something wrong. And on the topic as well, you also mentioned there that this same guard would ask prisoners why they were there, and almost uniformly they would answer, I have no idea why I'm here. And that didn't really change his attitude towards them.
Mm-hmm. Though he, in the end, did change. And do you remember in the book, like he tries to defect with these two young brothers?
Yes.
Do you remember that part in the story? He'd stolen a van. I think this was when because he then ended up in a prison camp too.
Yes, I believe he left the camp.
There's so much in this book, as you very sympathetically identified with me. You know, I just hope that people who are listening to this podcast will, if not get the book from a library, get it from somewhere, just spend some time looking through it, because, I mean, I did research so carefully all the details in it. And I mean, like I was saying to you earlier, I mean, I write because I don't feel so articulate when I talk. So I hope people won't take the way that I'm speaking as the way the book is. You know, the book has so much more to offer. So
you're doing yourself a disservice. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you, Jed. But well, thank God we're able to write things down, you know, because it's so hard to remember everything. But in this case, because he had, at some points, he had close contact with, he says, yes, at first, like, they're undermining the system. They're doing things badly. But, as I say in the book as well, I think somewhere that, no person is 100% bad. You're always going to find nuance within a character, within an individual person's character. There might be so many things you dislike about a person, but you can always find one or two, perhaps tiny little things that you think, oh, well, that's not, So when he was in these, as a guard of these political prison camps, I mean, as he said, they were in the mountains. There were no people around. So the prisoners became his sort of companions. And that's when he started to ask people, do you know, well, what happened within your family to have you here? And they would have no idea. And of course, if they even did have some idea or some inkling, it would have been some tiny little thing that they may have done, perhaps like, as I said, like an utterance during a drunken, party, or, the child brings out the Bible and the neighbors, the inminban, the local kind of, what would you call inminban in English? The local watch would kind of report it. These sorts of preposterous things that in ordinary, I shouldn't say ordinary, but in non-authoritarian regime, non-totalitarian regimes would never be an issue at all. So, he, he befriended, I suppose became close with many of the prisoners in some way. And then I think he was then, in fact, I know he was then put into the prison camp and found himself on the other side of the barbed wire, and then strove to escape, which he did. And he wanted to bring these two young brothers these two young siblings with him, these boys who were too terrified to escape, and then jumped out partway through. Extremely harrowing to think about. I mean, I do write about the prison camps in the book, but somebody could write an entire book about the system of prisons within North Korea, the re-education centers, the political prison camps, even just the detention facilities in police boxes. And of course, the treatment of women is horrendous in these camps, particularly when women are refouled when they're sent back from China. The health conditions inside these camps isn't anything like what people could imagine here, where I'm currently in Boston, in the city of the United States, the country of the United States. Of course, people will say, oh, America has a huge prison population. That's true. You're changing the topic, but also it's nothing on the level of North Korea. Disease is rampant, little of any access to food and medication. These organizations that are going in and trying to help North Koreans, for instance, in terms of tuberculosis and other kinds of medical treatments, are in no way ever permitted to access the prisons in North Korea, which would be where those incidences of illness are highest.
So I've got another question here about ideology. And again, we're not going to be able to dig into this in too much detail. As you mentioned just there, there's so much detail in this book that I've had to just brush over or not touch at all. So people do please go and read the book for itself. It's a flowing read, but there's tons and tons of detail in there that we're not going to get to. But one of the things that struck me is this moment of foreign workers that leave North Korea. Now, again, we're not going to be able to open up entirely here, but there was this very interesting moment. So North Korea lets foreign workers leave the country and then send hard cash reserves back to North Korea. And there was this really interesting moment because people think this might be a risky kind of strategy for North Korea, exposing North Korean workers to the world. And then there was this really interesting moment when you write a suitcase containing several handwritten notebooks was left in Uruguay accidentally by a North Korean worker. And then the media capture it and they open it up and you get this insight into a North Korean sailor. And you think he says his handwritten note, so people are expecting, complaints and gripes or even stuff about his life. And you write, the notebooks, this is a quote, the notebooks contain dozens of pages of carefully written notes. There were poems and songs about Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, as well as notes about Juche and the Charter of the Korean Workers' Party. Not a single personal or personalized note was reported found apart from the fact that the notes were handwritten. And that is a really a devastating insight into just how the totalitarian mindset can really swallow you up. This person is outside North Korea, handwritten notes by himself, and everything he writes is about North Korea, exactly what North Korea want him to be writing.
Yeah. In that part of the book, I think I talk about how they export human rights violations, meaning that they send the type of restrictions or the derogations on human rights that North Korea enforces within its borders. It sends those invisibly overseas with those workers, and individuals have to perform their abidance with those restrictions, with those rules. There are reports that self-criticism sessions continue overseas, though there are also some indications that there were some lapses in those self-criticism sessions, which happen about once weekly inside North Korea. So you would say, oh, well, I didn't work very hard for, Kim Jong-un this week or this day or whatever, or so-and-so kind of wasted some thread in whatever kind of sewing, operation, or, there are reports that North Korean overseas workers are kept without access to media in the countries, free media in the countries where they are resident. So, for instance, Poland, Czech Republic, Russia, China, even though there might be controls on media, for instance, in Russia or China, they're still not able to access the local media. And even if they can, are they able to understand it? Are they able to meet with locals? Are they even able to access their own wages? So absolutely not, basically, is the answer. Some people have thought that, as you alluded to, that if North Koreans get a breath of the quote-unquote free world, that they'll be able to then breathe that back into North Korea when they return, or they'll bring that sentiment back when they return. Well, they're not seeing any of the free world. I mean, they're basically trafficked individuals, although willingly being trafficked, because it's a privilege to be able to go overseas and to work. Unlike in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, North Korea sent people who were kind of politically questionable overseas to do very hard labor, for instance, logging in Russia. But now it's considered, a privilege to be able to go overseas, and of course you have to undergo some health tests, which can be bribed, incidentally. And also you need to have evidence you need to have, in fact, family members who remain back home inside North Korea. And it's important for me to add at this point that North Korea engages in something that Tae Young-ho, defector government official Tae Young-ho, is called love hostages, or kind of love abuse. So you have to have family members who remain back home so that you won't defect, because then you know what will happen to those family members who stay back home. They would be sent to political prison camp, or perhaps possibly humiliated or used on propaganda on television.
This has been the first part of a two-part podcast on Sandra Fahy's book Dying for Rights, putting North Korea's human rights abuses on record. The second podcast will follow shortly. But on that note, sounding off with Sandra's cat, this is the appropriate point to end this first part. The second and adjoining podcast will focus on the North Korean state and the North Korean denials, and the insights that this gives us to their own view of human rights, how they view the world, how they view themselves, and importantly what the future may look like for human rights in North Korea. I hope you enjoyed the first part, and I'll see you soon for the second.